Yeah, so that's one question I wanted to ask you, that here in the Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhist tradition, you find, you could say, two different approaches to reality or understanding the ultimate nature. One that is highly rational and philosophical, approaching through reason, and the other that is more intuitive, approaching through faith. And you chose, it seems, the second one. And I wanted to ask you, how did you prefer the second approach of seeing reality as a sort of a real thing, an absolute nature, over the other one? Is it just because you happen to follow teachers who were emphasizing more on the second approach than the first one?
I don't really see it that way at all. I don't see it as two. I mean, I know there are, there's the tradition that rejects the let's call it Shentong position, but I think all the way through I had that sense that you had to see what is false is false. And I think that's why I could spend quite a long time without really thinking about Buddha nature, because I was looking at what was false is false. And you don't abandon that when you realize, oh, hang on, when you see what's false is false, then what is true emerges. And that's a different way of seeing and a different way of relating. So, and I still see it that way. I don't see I've chosen one or the other.
But a lot of the Tibetan scholars and practitioners would argue that everything is false, right? That there's nothing that is truly there. Everything is like an illusion. So when you talk about Shentong, then there is something there.
That's right. And actually, I think if anybody really believed there was nothing there, they'd be nuts. They'd be completely unable to relate to the world. So they cover that up by saying it's all relatively there, and carry on, and they relate to the world exactly the same way as we have to be sane human beings or any kind of being. So I think that's a little bit of a necessary cop-out. If you're going to say everything's like an illusion and empty, you have to say, well, the relative is still there, otherwise you haven't got anything. But I think it's a really difficult thing to realize what's the difference between the relative is really there and it's empty, and actually reality is as it is, and everything that you punch or you contrive or you create conceptually ultimately is false. So I think in terms of a practitioner, they probably end up practicing in more or less the same way. But if you take the second position, and I think this is what you were getting at, if you take the position that there's only emptiness and impermanence, then you've got to kind of shore that up with believing in relative truth in some way. Whereas if you take the position that actually there's only ultimate reality, and that's what we're living in, and that's what we're relating to, but we've got a false view of it because of the way we're grasping onto our ideas and trying to exist in, just the way the Buddha taught, then you've got something to fall back on, which is, I don't have to do an awful lot of analysis to understand emptiness. I can actually link into it experientially, which is what I think faith is. From the Shentong point of view, that's what faith is. Whereas from the Rang-Tong point of view, faith is just belief, which of course, is useful if you've got believing in the right things, but it doesn't have that same sense of connecting directly to the living heart of what it is to be a being, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's great that we are going straight into it. So what I was trying to sort of get from you is, even when you look at the teachings of the Buddha in the Kanjur Canon or in the sutras, you have the sutras belonging to the second turning of the wheel, mostly declaring that everything is empty, everything is illusory. And then you have the sutras belonging to the third turning of the wheel, claiming some kind of a reality And then I think you find these differences in, say, even writings of Nagarjuna, in his rational writings, like the root verses on the middle way. He's super critical and reductionist in this approach. Then you have his corpus of praising the Dharma Dhatu, where he takes this more positive approach. So I was wondering how you, in your case, found the sort of latter, the positive approach, more preferable than the sort of critical, negative approach. That was what I was trying to understand.
I suppose I make this clear really in Buddha Within. There's two kinds of ways of taking an analytical approach. And the one is you exclude the possibility that there is actually anything ultimately that there to discover. It's just emptiness. And so all your argumentation is about showing that everything's empty and ultimately there's just emptiness, and that has to be the focus of your meditation. But there's another kind of way of interpreting that stage of the practice, or that side of the practice, which is what I call open-ended Rang-Tong. So rather than excluding the possibility that there is ultimately anything there, to put it, in ordinary language, you leave that question open and you just look at what you think is there. So when you're sitting in your meditation, you think these things arise and they stay and they go. And then you sit there and you meditate and try to watch them arise and stay and go. And then you get more and more puzzled and more puzzled. And then your teacher sort of comes along and says, well, what are you finding? And you say what you're finding. And then they sort of kind of give you a little bit of a hint here and there. And gradually you realize, oh, actually, as Nagarjuna says, it doesn't make sense. If I think that exists, that doesn't make sense. If I think it doesn't exist, that doesn't make sense. If I try not to think of either of them, I can't think of a way of making it make sense. And then gradually those other teachings, as you could say, the more affirmative teachings start to dawn. You start to realize, oh, hang on. This is why they teach love and compassion. This is why they teach that sentient beings are important, because there is something that is empty of my constructed ideas about it. I don't know if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, it makes very clear sense to me. So it is a very experiential discovery of something truly there, which is not empty of its own. Sorry,
both are experiential. Both the discovering that what I thought was real was not real, and the discovery that actually something else is emerging out of that.
But talking about implications, practical implications of such an understanding of seeing something as not being empty of itself, but only of other constructed adventitious elements, as is often put in the classical literature. When you have a sort of belief, or you have this understanding that there is something, then the criticism has been often, the classical criticism has been, you are verging towards something like a philosophical eternalism, taking something like the Brahmanical Atma or a theistic God or some sort of inconceivable thing out there which is truly real. And then the argument that people often present is such experience or practice is not going to liberate you. It's not going to fully sort of lead to enlightenment. I don't know how, for instance, in your own personal practice, you would be dealing with such issues.
Yes, it's the same whether you take a Rang-Tong position or a Shentong position. If you take it as a position and you sort of hold on to it, this is my view, this is my philosophical theory or view, this is what I believe in. Well, I think probably it's better to believe in that there is really some, that you do exist rather than that you don't exist. But when you're actually practicing, you're having to look at why do I think that and what is happening when I think that, and noticing that something's quite false. And then you can use the same language to kind of analyze and discover something that you do have words for. I mean, you say, oh, it's beyond words. Yeah, it's beyond words, but still you can point at it with words. And we do that all the time. And I particularly notice we do it with words like heart. That if I think about what's really important about myself or someone else, I don't think, oh, I exist and they exist. I just sense something directly that matters and is important. And I can't prove it intellectually. I can't prove that another being, that I'm experiencing another being. I can't prove that. But actually, and that's the same whether you've got a rank, you know, whether you take an analytical view and you're excluding a Shentong view, nonetheless, you're still operating from that point of view. And all the Buddhists I know, whatever view they hold about emptiness, they still have that same heart and that same way of relating as if it were real. And I'm glad they do. I'm glad they're not consistent.
Yeah, I suppose one of the misunderstandings people often have of Shentong, this theory that Buddha nature exists independently or is only empty of other things and not of its own nature. I mean, there seem to be misunderstanding that such a Buddha nature is also conceptually sort of conceivable, or let's say such Buddha nature is of some prapancha, of some, a mental fabrication, whereas the Shentong view clearly argues that it is totally free from any such conceptual conceptions. So it more or less reaches the same point as the very sort of rigorous Rang-Tong view would take you.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why I would call it an open-ended Rang-Tong view. You're demolishing all the false assumptions, all the constructions that you put over the top of what we're really experiencing. And then that's a really necessary ground for understanding that what's not that. So yeah, that's why I said I wouldn't separate them. I wouldn't say I chose one over the other. I could see that they were both very important. First, you have to, well, I don't know, some people, they seem to be very intuitive and they can actually find quite quickly what it is we're looking for. And then you see quite clearly what it is that's getting in the way. So you could call that a faith approach, but it's as rigorous as what you might call an analytical approach. And an analytical approach can end up with just a prapancha, just an idea of emptiness. So I don't think you can avoid the mistake of not recognizing nishprapancha for what it is. I hope people understand nishprapancha. I mean, it's usually translated as, what would you say? How would you translate nishprapancha? I never know.
Freedom from elaborations or fabrications, I mean, absence of mental fabrications. But I want to share this. I mean, I personally think that the first approach, the more rational, gradual, sort of analytical approach is quite well structured, and it sort of takes you step by step. First, getting over the attachment to existence, then getting over the attachment to non-existence, and so forth, using so many different kinds of arguments. Whereas the sort of Shentong approach, or the approach that adopts a more positive sort of faith-based, or even when you use, say, mind-pointing instructions or whatever, it's less gradual, it's less structured in a way. So maybe it's more reliable for beginners to go through the first approach because it's well structured and systematic. And then for more sharp individuals and those who are capable of it, they can sort of approach it positively. I don't want to use this word. Cataphatic is the word that academics often use. A very direct, positive approach to Buddha nature. So would you say that? Because I personally think the second option risk leaving a lot of people in some kind of a mistaken form of meditation. And a lot of Tibetan masters have actually raised this concern that you may just end up meditating on nothing, thinking that you are meditating on the freedom from elaborations.
Yes, there's always a danger, but I don't think you need to kind of approach it in a linear fashion. I think you can approach two ways at once. That's what I've discovered, especially with when I'm teaching my students. The first problem they have is they don't have any faith in anything. Life seems pretty meaningless. So the first thing, I don't think there's an awful lot of value in telling them that they'd, trying to demolish further. I think what they need is something that they can really relate to as, yes, I want to engage in this. I want to follow this. This is helping me to relate to my experience. And so I would start with something, and I use this word heart very carefully, really. Get them to look at, well, what is it that you intuit in your heart that is making you feel that there's a path to awakening, and I want to follow this path, and there is a Buddha, and there is actually a refuge, there is actually love and compassion, and these are all real things. So I think, well, if I leave them there, that's not a bad place to leave them, because that will make sure that they practice, the 10 good actions and avoid the negative actions because of the love and compassion that's there, and it's already in our culture. Our culture is very much values that love and compassion and heart and so on. So once they've got some confidence in themselves, and I find a lot of people in the West, they really are very hard on themselves. They're just trying to find some way to, in a way, they want to hear they don't exist because they really feel that they're a terrible blot on the landscape. So I feel that's more important to correct that. And then once they've got going, and they start to say, well, I want to follow this path, and what is this emptiness and so on, and then I can take them through the progressive stages of meditation on emptiness, and it's not contradictory. It's really not contradictory. But yes, you do have to have a teacher there who's leading you through, or a mentor, somebody who's got a whole program in mind. If you only get half any of these programs, you end up with a wrong view. You have to follow a particular program of training through, and then it can be balanced as you go along. And the other thing I find is it's not linear. You don't understand the view and then you come to the Shentong understanding. You get a bit of the understanding of the view, and you might get stages of the view. You get a bit of an understanding of several stages of the view, but you still have to come around again. It's not like, done that, now next stage. It's usually, oh, I've got a glimpse of that. That makes sense. Oh, now I've got a question. Oh, question is in the next stage. Oh, then I've got an understanding of that. But I haven't really understood the first stage. So you spiral around and you come around again and again to the same points. So I present that in our Sangha. That's a key thing in the way we present our curriculum, that it's spiral, not linear.
Well, that's fascinating, and it's so interesting to know, because I think in the Tibetan traditions here, sometimes you find too much of that linearity. No, you have some schools that will only go with the analytical, apophatic approach. The others who will probably use the practice of mind pointing instructions and then try to only use the more intuitive approach. I actually like your mention of heart many times. I think these two approaches I often put as the rational approach and the romantic approach. Here you're sort of going around taking up both the rational and the romantic. And in some cases, I think that is probably the most effective.
It would be sorry.
Yeah. Please.
It would be very sad if somebody went away just thinking everything was impermanent and changing and suffering, and that was Buddhism. That would be very sad. But if they went away thinking it's all about love and compassion, well, it wouldn't be too bad. There's lots of good people in the world who get that far, and if I can help them, I think that's good for everybody.
No, I think that element wouldn't go away as much, even if there is no, say, the Shentong romantic intuitive approach. I think even with the Rang-Tong, or even if you're not a Rang-Tong, even being a basic Mahayana or Buddhist alone, you get a lot of love and compassion, like the four immeasurables in the teachings. But what I like really is your approach of moving from one approach to the other, or using different ways, sort of coming back again, as you said, in a kind of a swirling way.